Hello Libra. If Libra is your sun sign, moon sign, or rising sign, then this reading is for you. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy tarot stories that invite reflection, healing, and deeper self-awareness. This is a general reading, so I encourage you to stay open to whatever resonates with your heart. Not every detail will reflect your personal situation, and that's perfectly okay. Take what speaks to you and gently leave the rest behind. Throughout this journey, I'm simply the storyteller sharing what unfolds through the cards. The most important guide here will always be your own intuition, your experiences, and the unique perspective only you can bring to this reading. And now, Libra, let's take a look at what these cards may be revealing about the emotional chapter you're moving through right now. Some sadness doesn't come from a big argument. It comes from much smaller things. A text message that takes a little longer than usual to get a reply. A conversation that slowly becomes shorter and shorter. The feeling that someone is still there, but no longer truly present. And Libra, one thing that comes through very strongly in this energies is that you've been carrying that feeling much longer than most people realize. There were times when you told yourself everything would eventually be okay. Times when you tried to find a reasonable explanation for the changes that were happening. Because that's how you've always approached relationships. You don't like conflict. You don't like distance. You're often the one willing to take one more step to keep the bridge between two people from collapsing. But sometimes, the only person still trying to hold that bridge together is you. The Nine of Swords card comes through here as a period when your mind never truly got a chance to rest. Not that you always showed it. To most people, you still look like Libra, polite, composed, in control of your emotions. But there were private moments. Moments that belonged only to you and the silence around you. Moments when a song unexpectedly pulled you back into an old conversation. When a familiar road reminded you of someone who used to walk beside you. When you lay awake, wondering if there was something you could have done differently. Something that should have been said. Something that may have been misunderstood. Or whether the distance had actually begun long before you noticed it. The difficult thing about emotional distance is that it rarely appears overnight. It arrives slowly. So slowly that sometimes we don't recognize it until it's already too late. The Six of Swords card appears here like the image of someone gradually stepping out of the story. Not through a dramatic goodbye, not through a door slammed shut, but through sharing less, asking fewer questions, showing up less often, like the tide quietly pulling back from the shore, until all that's left is an empty stretch of sand. And what made this especially hard for you, Libra, is that you saw it happening, you felt it happening, yet you chose to stay a little longer, not because you were weak, but because you've always believed that sincerity could heal cracks before they become fractures. You tried to keep the peace. You tried to find common ground. You tried to be more understanding, more patient, more compassionate. But sometimes the harder we try to pull someone closer, the more we realize they're still moving farther away. And that's one of the most painful lessons adulthood teaches us. Love, friendship, and every meaningful connection require more than one person carrying the weight. Then the Four of Cups card comes through, bringing with it a very quiet kind of disappointment. Not the kind that breaks you all at once, but the kind that sits beside you. The kind that appears when you're face to face with something you once wanted deeply, and your heart no longer knows what to do with it. It's like spending so much time waiting for a sign, an explanation, a change, until the waiting itself becomes exhausting. There were days when you thought you were okay. Days when you genuinely smiled, stayed busy, kept moving forward, and then a small memory would appear out of nowhere. And you'd realize there was still a part of your heart that hadn't completely let go. Not because you wanted to return to the past, but because the human heart needs time to accept what it cannot change. Maybe the hardest part for Libra was never someone walking away. Maybe the hardest part was accepting that you had already done everything you could. You tried. You were honest. You stayed when many others would have left. And sometimes the only thing left to do isn't trying one more time to fix everything. Sometimes it's gently putting down what was never yours to control. Like finally letting go of a rope you've been pulling for far too long. Not because you stopped caring, but because you're finally beginning to care for yourself a little more. And somewhere within that silence, a truth is starting to become clearer. A truth that perhaps you weren't quite ready to look at before. Because sometimes the thing that hurts us most isn't what happened. It's what we tried so hard not to see. For a long time, it feels like Libra kept trying to hold everything in balance. You listened more. You became more patient. You told yourself that everyone goes through difficult seasons. Maybe they were just busy. Maybe they were carrying burdens you couldn't see. Maybe they simply needed more time. But eventually, there comes a point when those explanations are no longer enough to quiet your intuition. The Seven of Swords card comes through here, carrying the feeling of empty spaces that were never filled with honesty. Not necessarily a major lie. Sometimes it's simply the feeling that someone wasn't saying everything that was on their mind. Not sharing everything that was happening in their world. Not showing up in the same way they once did. And the strange thing is, Libra often senses those changes long before anyone says a word. Before there is proof. Before there is confirmation. Before the situation is ever named out loud. You notice it in someone's eyes. In their voice. In the way they begin holding back things they once shared freely. But because you're naturally someone who wants to see the good in people, you spent a long time convincing yourself that everything would eventually work itself out. Until the pieces slowly began finding each other. Not through some dramatic revelation, but quietly. A passing comment. A detail that once seemed insignificant. A memory returning with an entirely different meaning. It's like stepping back from a painting and suddenly noticing something that had been there the whole time. Something you simply couldn't see before. Then the Queen of Swords card appears. And this feels like the moment you stop arguing with yourself. You stop searching for more excuses. You stop trying to use imagination to create clarity where clarity doesn't exist. Because sometimes maturity doesn't come from learning more information. It comes from accepting what you've known deep down all along. Maybe your heart wasn't ready to admit it, but somewhere inside you already understood. You understood who was trying, who was drifting away, who kept reaching for the conversation, and who allowed silence to speak in their place. The truth is that realization doesn't make things easier. If anything, it can hurt even more. Because truth is rarely soft. It doesn't arrive to comfort us, it arrives to set us free. The Ten of Swords card carries the feeling of a chapter reaching a point where it can no longer continue in the way it once did. Not because you failed, not because you weren't enough, and not because you did something wrong, but because some journeys can only end when we stop forcing them to go farther than they were ever meant to go. There is a quiet kind of maturity in that. It's the moment you stop waking up every morning asking yourself what happened. You stop spending hours analyzing every little detail. You stop searching for answers in places that were never going to provide them. Instead, you begin giving that energy back to yourself, to your own life, to the people and experiences that are still present. And maybe the most beautiful thing about this process is that it hasn't made you bitter. It has simply made you wiser. You haven't closed your heart. You've just learned the difference between something worth holding on to and something that has already completed its role in your life. There were truths that once frightened you, truths you didn't want to face. But when you finally looked directly at them, you realized you were far stronger than you had believed. And from that clarity, a new kind of space begins to open. A space no longer crowded with unanswered questions. No longer filled with assumptions and uncertainty. Just an open path slowly appearing ahead of you. Clear enough for you to begin asking yourself what truly deserves your time, your heart, and your energy. That's when the Ace of Pentacles card comes through. Not like some loud announcement echoing through your life, but more like opening a window one morning and realizing the air feels different. Everything outside may look the same. The same streets, the same routines, the same familiar responsibilities, and yet something inside you has shifted. After spending so much time caught in unfinished emotions, Libra begins to feel drawn toward things that feel more tangible. Things that can be built. Things that can be nurtured. Things that bring a sense of peace instead of creating more questions. Maybe it's a plan that sat on the shelf for too long. An opportunity that once slipped by unnoticed. An idea you didn't have the energy to pursue before. Or maybe it's something even simpler. The desire to live a little differently. To spend more time with yourself. To invest in the parts of life that offer lasting value instead of temporary distraction. It's like standing on the other side of a storm and realizing the ground is still there beneath your feet. Still fertile enough for something new to grow. But the interesting thing is that when a new door begins to open, the past doesn't always disappear right away. The Two of Wands card appears here as the image of someone standing between two directions. One path leads toward what's familiar, familiar memories, familiar emotions, even familiar sadness. The other path stretches toward territory you don't fully know yet, a journey without a map, a chapter without clear answers. And if you're honest with yourself, Libra, you understand that feeling. Sometimes people aren't afraid of pain, we're afraid of the unknown. At least old heartbreak is something we've learned how to live with. At least old memories are places we know by heart. But moving forward always asks for a little courage. There are days when you feel completely detached from the past. And then a song comes on, a place catches your attention, a name appears somewhere unexpectedly. And suddenly your mind drifts backward again. Not because you want to stay there, but because sometimes the heart needs more time to catch up with what the mind has already decided. Then the Five of Swords card comes through as a reminder of something that once drained you deeply. Not a battle with another person, but a battle within yourself. The struggle between holding on and letting go. Between searching for one more explanation and accepting that not every question receives an answer. Between focusing on what was lost and noticing what is still waiting ahead. One thing that feels different now, Libra, is that you're no longer interested in winning battles that cost you your peace. There may have been times in the past when you felt the need to prove yourself, to prove that you were good enough, patient enough, loving enough, sincere enough. But the older we become, the more we realize that our value isn't determined by whether someone else can recognize it. Peace doesn't come from being validated. It comes from no longer needing to prove who you are. And that's why this energy feels so different. It doesn't feel like an ending. But it doesn't feel entirely like a beginning either. It's more like standing in a doorway. One hand still touching the chapter behind you, the other already reaching toward what's ahead. There's something powerful about that space. Because it's where people begin to remember that they have a choice. A choice about where their energy goes. A choice about what deserves their continued attention. A choice about who truly deserves a place beside them on the road ahead. And as those choices become clearer, something else begins to quietly awaken within you. As though a truth has been waiting patiently beneath the surface, existing for a long time as nothing more than a feeling, a suspicion, a thought that never quite found its name. There are seasons in life when change begins on the outside, and there are seasons when it begins within, with a new realization, a different perspective, a truth we finally stop running from. The Judgment card carries that feeling. It's like standing in front of a mirror and truly seeing yourself for the first time. Not the version other people expected you to be. Not the version that spent years trying to keep everyone happy, but the most honest version of yourself. And Libra, it feels like you're getting very close to that moment. Because after everything you've been through, you're beginning to understand something important. Not every story is meant to be saved. Not every relationship needs to be held on to at all costs. And not every apology has the power to change what already happened. Realizations like these rarely arrive all at once. They unfold little by little, through ordinary mornings, through quiet moments alone with your thoughts, through those unexpected times when you notice you're no longer reacting the way you used to. Something that once broke your heart now leaves behind only a quiet sigh. Something that once kept you awake at night no longer occupies your entire mind. And that's when you know you're changing. Not because you've forgotten, but because you've come to understand things more deeply. Then the Ace of Swords card appears, bringing with it a sense of clarity. Like a sky that's been covered in clouds for days finally revealing the horizon. Maybe that clarity comes through a conversation. Maybe through a confession. Maybe through information you didn't have before. But what feels most important here is that this energy isn't centered on what someone else has to say. It's centered on the fact that Libra is finally beginning to understand what they want. And those are two very different things. Because in the past, you may have spent a great deal of time waiting for someone else to provide the answers, waiting for explanations, waiting for decisions, waiting for change. But now the focus is slowly returning to where it belongs, back to you. You begin asking yourself questions like, what do I truly want? How much longer do I want to carry this? Am I living in the present, or am I still living inside old memories? Those are mature questions. And sometimes simply having the courage to ask them is enough to shift the direction of your life. Then the Magician card comes through as the image of someone realizing they have more power than they once believed. Not the power to control other people, not the power to rewrite the past, but the power to create a new chapter using what is already in their hands. Maybe everything isn't perfect yet. Maybe there are still things that haven't been fully resolved. But Libra is no longer standing in the role of someone who only waits. You're beginning to see the resources you already possess, your skills, your experience, your lessons, your resilience. The limitations that once made you doubt yourself don't seem quite as intimidating anymore, because you've already made it through more than you often give yourself credit for. There's something very unique about this energy. It's like closing a door behind you and realizing you're no longer turning around every few steps to look back. Not because that door didn't matter, but because something ahead of you has become interesting enough to keep you moving forward. And during this period, things that have remained unspoken may begin finding their way to the surface. Certain truths, certain emotions, certain words that have been delayed for far too long. It's almost as if, after all the detours, the silence, and the unfinished pieces, the story is slowly reaching a place where things can finally be called by their real names. Not to turn back time, not to undo what's already happened, but so that everyone involved can stand in front of their own truth without feeling the need to hide from it anymore. And sometimes, when the truth is finally seen for what it is, another feeling begins to emerge. Regret. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic words spoken in the middle of an argument, but the kind of regret that only appears once everything has become quiet enough. When there is no longer so much noise competing for attention. When a person finally has the space to look back on the road they've traveled. The Page of Cups card comes through with a very specific energy. It's like someone standing face to face with thoughts they've spent a long time pushing aside. There are feelings that were postponed, words that were never spoken, moments when they convinced themselves they would be fine if they simply left everything behind. But time has a way of bringing forgotten things back into focus. Maybe they begin remembering ordinary conversations, short text messages, small moments they once took for granted. Because when someone has been part of our lives for a very long time, it's easy to overlook the value of their presence. Sometimes it's only when the space is empty that we fully realize what used to fill it. And that's what this energy feels like. Not simply someone remembering Libra, but someone looking back at themselves. Looking back at the choices that brought them to where they are now. Looking back at the things they never said, the things they never did, the opportunities that passed through their hands before they understood their importance. Then the Knight of Cups card appears like an emotion that's finally asking to be expressed. Like someone who has carried something in their heart for far too long and no longer wants to keep it there in silence. Not necessarily because they're hoping everything can go back to the way it was, but because some words have a way of lingering in the mind when they remain unsaid. Maybe it's an apology. Maybe it's an explanation. Maybe it's an acknowledgement of something they were unable to admit before. Or simply a different understanding of what truly happened. What feels different here is that this person no longer seems to be looking at the story through the eyes of the past. They're beginning to see it through the lens of maturity, the kind of maturity that only time can bring. And one of the interesting things is about real growth is that it often comes with less blame. People become more willing to take responsibility for their part. They begin noticing what they once overlooked. They begin understanding why certain wounds ran so deep. Some lessons don't arrive while we're living through the experience. They arrive afterward, after the door has closed, after the silence has lasted long enough, after someone has had time to live with the consequences of the choices they made. The Three of Cups card carries the feeling of a connection quietly searching for its way back toward itself, not through pressure, not through force, but more like someone slowly walking back toward a bridge, wondering if it's still standing. This energy isn't focused on outcomes, it's focused on movement, on the way emotions evolve over time. On the way the human heart sometimes needs much longer than expected to understand the value of what it once had. And from Libra's side of the story, the most important thing isn't what this person may be thinking. It's how much you've changed during that same period. Because when someone begins reflecting on what they've lost, they often don't realize that the person they're remembering today may no longer be the same person they once knew. People continue growing, continue learning, continue healing, continue changing. And sometimes that distance isn't measured by time alone. It's measured by the lessons each person has gathered while walking their own path. Something is becoming clearer within this picture now, not only about another person's feelings, but about Libra's value, a value that perhaps you gave away too freely in the past, a value that you're beginning to recognize through a completely different set of eyes. And perhaps what's becoming clearer now isn't just Libra's value. It's the distance between who you are today and who you were not so long ago. Because when you look back on this journey, it feels like you've traveled farther than you realize. Not geographically, not through milestones that other people can easily see, but internally, in the way you think, in the way you respond to things that once hurt you, in the way you've started treating yourself. The Eight of Swords card comes through as the image of a version of Libra that spent too long living inside invisible limitations. Limitations that didn't come from circumstances, but from the stories you told yourself. That you needed to try a little harder, be a little more patient, love a little more, sacrifice a little more, and maybe then things would be different. Those are deeply human thoughts. But they're also the thoughts that can leave someone carrying far more weight than they were ever meant to carry. Some cages aren't built from iron bars. They're built from self-doubt, from the feeling of not being enough, from the fear of losing something important. And the strange thing is, when someone lives inside that cage for too long, they sometimes forget the door was never actually locked. This energy feels like Libra slowly beginning to realize that, not through one dramatic breakthrough, but little by little, like sunlight slipping through a curtain in the morning. At first, it's only a thin beam of light, but it's enough to remind you that darkness no longer fills the entire room. Then the King of Swords card appears, not as someone cold or emotionally distant, but as someone who finally trusts their own perception. Because there's a huge difference between becoming closed off and becoming clear. In the past, you may have looked outward for validation, through someone else's words, through the way they treated you, through whether they chose you or not. But now it feels as though the compass is slowly turning inward. You begin trusting what you feel, trusting what you've observed, trusting the lessons life has already taught you. You no longer ignore the signals your intuition keeps sending. You no longer explain away inconsistent behavior. You no longer convince yourself that everything is fine when some deeper part of you knows it isn't. That's not rigidity, that's self-respect. And there is a kind of peace that only appears when a person stops betraying their own truth. From that place, the star card begins to shine in its own unique way, not as the light of perfection, but as the light of someone who has walked through difficult seasons and somehow managed to keep their heart soft. There's something genuinely beautiful about this energy, because after everything you've been through, Libra, you haven't become cynical. You haven't shut your heart down. You haven't stopped believing in good things. You've simply started putting them in their proper place. You're beginning to understand that peace isn't about keeping someone from leaving. Peace is not losing yourself while trying to keep someone else. You're beginning to understand that love shouldn't leave a person feeling constantly uncertain. A connection shouldn't require someone to shrink themselves in order to maintain it. And another person's presence should never become the condition for feeling whole. There may still be days when memories return, moments when something from the past unexpectedly drifts across your mind. But those memories no longer hold the steering wheel. They're simply part of the story that helped shape who you are today. Someone who understands themselves more deeply. Someone calmer, steadier, and perhaps someone who finally knows how to offer themselves the same kindness they've spent so much time giving to others. When a person begins seeing their own value through a different lens, everything around them starts to change as well. Things they once accepted no longer feel acceptable. Things that once left them uncertain become easier to recognize. And from that place of peace, Libra's heart seems ready to enter a very different chapter. One that is no longer guided by the fear of loss, but by the sense of security you've spent so much time rediscovering within yourself. The interesting thing is that when someone truly begins finding peace within themselves, they stop looking at relationships the way they once did. They stop asking, who's going to stay? And they start asking, who is truly aligned with where I'm going? That's a profound shift. And it's the energy that comes through very strongly here. The Queen of Cups card appears as the image of a connection built on emotional maturity, not impulsive feelings, not the kind of attraction that arrives quickly and disappears just as fast, but the feeling of being able to sit beside someone in silence and still feel at ease, not needing to guess what they're thinking, not constantly searching for proof that you're loved. Some relationships enter our lives like a storm. Everything feels intense, emotional, full of highs and lows. But there are other connections too, the quieter ones, the gentler ones, the ones that don't necessarily create drama when they first arrive, because what they offer isn't excitement. It's safety. And sometimes, after experiencing enough heartbreak, a person realizes that safety may be one of the most valuable things of all. The Four of Wands card carries the feeling of a place where the heart can finally rest. Not a physical place, but the feeling of being yourself, showing up exactly as you are without fear of being judged. Maybe there was a time when Libra believed love had to be intense in order to be real. But now you're beginning to see that stability has its own kind of beauty, a quiet beauty, a mature beauty, a beauty very different from what you've known before. This energy feels like walking into your home after a long day. No need to be on guard. No need to prepare for conflict. No need to wonder what might go wrong next. Just the simple feeling of exhaling, relaxing, being exactly where you belong. Then the Knight of Pentacles card appears. Unlike energies that rush in and disappear just as quickly, this one carries the feeling of consistency. Someone who knows what they want. Someone who doesn't rely on grand promises to make an impression. Someone who expresses their feelings through actions more than words. In a world where everything moves so fast, consistency can feel surprisingly rare. And because it's rare, it becomes valuable. This energy speaks of a connection that isn't built on fantasy, not built on unrealistic expectations, but built on steady presence, small acts repeated over time. Showing up when it matters, following through on what is said. Creating enough security that no one is left constantly wondering where they stand. Then the Lover's card comes through. Not as a fairy tale about two perfect people finding one another, but as a mature choice. A choice made when two people understand the value of connection, the value of partnership, the understanding that love is more than a feeling. It's the decision to keep showing up for one another, to keep listening, to keep building something together. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about this energy isn't perfection. It's the sense that everything no longer has to be so difficult. No more battles that leave you emotionally exhausted. No more feeling like you have to prove your worth. No more sacrificing your peace in order to hold on to a connection. And maybe that's what Libra has been searching for all along. Not a perfect person, but a feeling. The feeling of being appreciated, respected, seen, loved without constantly questioning whether that love is real. When someone begins experiencing this kind of peace, they often look back on the past through a very different lens. There is less blame, less regret. Only the understanding that every chapter played a role in bringing them to where they are today. And from that place, a final realization begins to take shape. A realization that is no longer centered around who left or who may return, but around the person Libra chooses to become after everything they've lived through. Because by the time the story reaches this point, something important has begun to shift. The focus is no longer on someone else. It's coming back to you, to your heart, to your life, to the future you're trying to create for yourself. The Five of Cups card comes through like a gentle acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that there were losses that genuinely hurt. Things that didn't unfold the way you hoped they would. Moments when you wondered how long it might take to finally move on. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with admitting that. Not every wound needs to be hidden behind strength. Not every sadness needs to be turned into a lesson right away. Some feelings simply need to be recognized, heard, given enough space to heal in their own time. But this is where the difference between the Libra of today and the Libra of the past becomes clear. You no longer live inside that sadness. You can still see it, but it no longer controls you. You can remember the past, but you no longer allow the past to decide your future. And that's a very deep kind of freedom. Then the King of Swords card appears once again as a symbol of the maturity you've built along the way. Not the kind of maturity that comes from always being right, but the kind that comes from knowing what truly deserves your energy. Questions that once consumed hours of your attention now seem surprisingly simple, not because life has become easier, but because you've become clearer. You're beginning to understand that not every closed door needs to be reopened. Not everyone who returns needs to stay, and not every second chance carries the same meaning. This energy feels like a Libra who is making decisions from wisdom instead of loneliness, from self-respect instead of fear, from peace instead of emotional scarcity. And that's a powerful transformation. Because when people make choices from a place of inner peace, they often choose very differently. The Ten of Swords card carries the feeling of a chapter that has fulfilled its purpose, not a chapter that needs to be erased, but one that deserves its proper place in the story. Some people arrive to walk beside us for years. Others arrive to teach us something about ourselves. Some stories don't last forever, yet they still leave a lasting mark. And perhaps the most beautiful part is that you're no longer fighting that truth. You're no longer trying to stretch something beyond its natural ending. No longer trying to hold on to an older version of yourself. No longer trying to live inside what has already ended. Instead, you're allowing yourself to move forward, step by step, more gently, more honestly. Then the Ace of Wands card comes through, not like a dramatic explosion, not like some unexpected miracle, but more like a small flame being relit inside your heart, a feeling of excitement you haven't felt in quite some time, a fresh energy, a new idea, a different perspective on life, like the first signs of spring finally appearing after a long winter. Not every flower blooms at once, but something within you knows that life is returning. Perhaps someone carrying regret finds their way back into the picture. Perhaps words that remained unspoken finally find a voice. Perhaps certain old doors receive another knock. But what matters most in this energy isn't what someone else chooses to do. It's the fact that Libra has learned how to listen to themselves, how to place their own peace alongside any relationship rather than beneath it, how to make choices without being led by fear. And maybe that's the greatest gift this journey leaves behind. Not someone else's answer, but a deeper connection with yourself. A connection strong enough that no matter what unfolds ahead, you can continue walking forward with an open heart without losing yourself along the way.